Hi, this is Emerald and welcome to the Diamond Net, and today I'm going to be talking to you about manipulation. Alright, so in today's video, I'm going to be talking a bit about manipulation, what it is, and how we can unconsciously engage in it without meaning to. But first, let me give a quick definition of what manipulation is. So manipulation is whenever a person tries to indirectly evoke a response in another person that they want or that they need without directly asking for it. Here are some examples of manipulation. So let's say that there's a child and they don't know how to ask for their needs, and they don't know how to communicate what it is that they want, and so they throw a tantrum to get what it is that they want. Another example would be, let's say that there are two spouses, and spouse number one says to spouse number two, it's like, oh, you are really way better at cleaning up than I am, and so you're just such a better cleaner, in order to kind of puff up their ego in hopes of manipulating them into doing more of the chores. Or let's say two people have just started dating, and so when person number one texts person number two makes sure that they wait at least a few hours before responding, because they don't want the other person to think they're desperate, because they want to essentially indirectly manipulate that person into liking them more based off of the idea that, distance makes the heart grow fonder. Or a person might try to achieve things or seek success in order to manipulate other people into approving of them. Or a person might do something as simple as putting their best foot forward in social situations in hopes that other people will think well of them. So instead of directly trying to say, hey, I want you guys to think well of me, and so I'm doing this and I'm hiding these parts of myself and showing these parts of myself, it's sort of hiding those parts, putting those parts forward in hopes of evoking that reaction in the other person. Now, there can also be more conscious forms of manipulation where a person consciously and willfully does it, where they're like, okay, I want this person to play this role for me, and so I'm going to set up this whole scenario over here. So it can also be a conscious process, and oftentimes manipulation tends to be associated with quite negative things as a result of that. And so manipulation as a word tends to have a lot of those connotations to it, because we think of the conscious manipulator who's cold and calculating and conniving. But in reality, most manipulation actually happens from people who are totally unconscious to the fact that they're manipulating. And everyone manipulates to some degree or another. Everyone has done it before. And chances are we probably are doing it quite often, because it can really sneak into our behaviors in unexpected ways. So from a consciousness work perspective, we want to look at, where does unconscious manipulation come from? And this really comes from two main places. The first place is not being able to understand or articulate our wants and needs properly. So when it's the case that we can't quite put into words, we can't quite crystallize what it is that we actually want, we still have just general urges and intuitions to go in that direction. And so we'll find ourselves probably just trying to indirectly meet those needs. And this is where the shadow comes in. So the idea of the shadow is basically these parts of ourself that we've gone unconscious to, and these parts are autonomous from us. And these parts start to operate underneath the surface of consciousness and then manipulate the conscious personality into behaving in certain ways. And oftentimes there's an attempt to get a certain need met or to get certain wants met in unconscious ways. So oftentimes this can happen when it's the case that we're not fully intellectually aware of what we want or need, and we don't know how to articulate it. The other reason we can go into unconscious manipulation is if we're aware of our wants and needs, but we have some kind of feeling of shame around them, like we shouldn't want or need that thing. So sometimes this can come up in like romantic settings where, let's say, it might be very vulnerable to express a certain need, like a need to be taken care of or a need to be reassured or, something of that nature. And so when that's the case, if the person can't say, hey, I'm feeling a little insecure, I need some reassurance, what they might do is they might behave in passive-aggressive ways in hopes that the other person will read their mind and start to reassure them. And on a related note, I actually have a personal story that somewhat matches up to this. So back when I was 16 years old, when I had my first serious boyfriend, who I was with for about 4 years, but for the first 3 months or so of that relationship, there was a certain manipulation tactic that I was using to get a certain response out of him. So this is how that began. So he was very doting in certain ways. And let's say if he accidentally bumped into me, or if he accidentally stepped on my toe or did something small like that, he would basically be very, very almost groveling for forgiveness. Like, oh no, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. And I don't know why he would do that, but for some reason this pushed a button for me. And I can look back now and I can realize it's because he was prioritizing apologizing to me over being right. And so it was almost like he was able to like not focus on his ego and just focus on if I'm feeling okay, which is something that it was a need that I needed from earlier times in childhood that I didn't have met. And so it's like it met this fundamental need. And so what I was doing is I would go through the day and I would try to find different reasons to be like upset with him. And I would act like passive aggressive and I would just be like, fine then, like this type of behavior. And so I would always be trying to get that same button pushed over and over again. And I didn't realize what I was doing. I couldn't have articulated to myself at the time, like why him apologizing like that made me feel warm and fuzzy. All I knew is that it felt good to me. And even that wasn't really conscious. It was just almost sort of like I was operating off of like these baser instincts just to try to, hit that same emotional button over and over and over again. And if I had been more conscious at the time of why I was trying to get that response from him, I could have actually, put that into words and actually had a conversation with him about it and say, hey, when you apologize to me, it makes me feel really cared for because it makes me feel like you care more about, the relationship with me than being right in the circumstance. If I would have been able to articulate that directly, I probably could have gotten that need met more directly. But I just kept pushing that button. And then, of course, over the course of like a few months, he eventually got fed up with it. And it was like, oh, no, this is eroding the relationship. And I really valued the relationship, so I stopped doing it. But I wish I would have been a little bit more conscious at the time. And there have been other times that I've noticed like manipulation tendencies come up. And it's usually around I have some kind of need or some kind of want or there's some kind of emotional wound that I'm trying to address. Like one of the big manipulations of my life has been that underneath the surface of consciousness, there's always been this tendency to say, please love me, please love me, please love me. And I wasn't conscious of this until a handful of years ago. But in all of the actions that I've ever done, and perhaps even including this action now, there's this desire to like be getting love from the outside. And part of it has had to do with the fact that I've had issues with self-love. Shame has been one of my core wounds. And so it's like looking outside of myself and, trying to achieve things or trying to do things well or, trying to be admirable in some way or different in some way. So I get that admiration. Or like in, let's say, relationships with people, like friendships and romantic partnerships, it's like trying to come across a particular way, maybe look a particular way or act a particular way in order to get the love. And so all of this qualifies underneath the umbrella of a manipulation. Now, the first step to avoiding manipulative tendencies is to start to pay attention to where you find yourself manipulating. So there have been situations where I've actually been manipulating and become conscious in the middle of it that I'm manipulating a situation. And this is the kind of awareness that you want to develop because it can come through in very, very subtle ways. So some of the telltale signs of if you're manipulating are if you're trying to evoke a reaction in a certain person, like you want that person to say something or to do something or to address some kind of feeling in yourself, or you want them to make you feel a certain way, or you want them to do a certain thing. And, so all of these things, come into play if you find yourself manipulating. Or if there's something that you want and either that person is a middleman to getting the thing that you want, or that you perceive them to be a middleman to getting that thing that you want, in those cases, you might try to manipulate that person. So for example, if I, let's say, have a need for love and connection and companionship, and then I feel like, oh, I need to get that need met by this person. If I am very narrow in my ideas of how I can get that need met, it can feel like, oh, this is the one and only outlet to get the love. And so at that point, we start kind of like trying to find ways to get love through the outlet. So we might, let's say if it's a faucet, let's say we keep trying to jiggle the handle and we keep trying to slam into it. We try to find every single way that we can, get the love, even if that person isn't open to that. You can also notice this manipulative tendency if there's like a feeling of frustration and of wanting a situation to go in a particular direction. So if you really, really want something to happen and you feel like somebody else is in control of that thing happening, then it's like trying to direct the circumstance in that direction. So those are all things to look out for if you're trying to spot your own manipulations. But the way to really avoid manipulating is to be able to get really, really clear about what you want and to feel unashamed to honestly express that. And so you want to get really good at a process that I call crystallization. And that's basically where you put, let's say, kind of emotions and urges and intuitions into, like, let's say, a more, intellectual word-based form. So the reason why I call this process crystallization is because, let's say we have the element of water. Water tends to represent things like the emotions and the intuition and the subconscious, things that are just kind of intangible, a bit nebulous. And so water tends to be a common symbol for that. Because if you try to grasp a hold of water, it just flows right through your fingers and you can't really grasp it. But if you put it in the freezer, it starts to crystallize. Little crystalline structures start to form, and then you have ice cubes. And an ice cube is something that you can actually hold in your hands. And so what you're doing with, let's say, these more watery intuitions is you are actually like converting them into a form that's graspable from the perspective of the intellect. So that you can actually form it into a word-based structure that you can articulate to yourself and articulate to others. And the more honest and thorough you can get with this process of crystallization, the better. So let me take, for example, let's say the idea of like the couple, and one of the members of the couple is being passive-aggressive in order to evoke a certain response in the other person. And so the person, because they're unconscious to their needs or they're ashamed of their needs, they're not articulating those needs, and they're kind of expecting the other person to solve the problem for them and expecting the other person to guess. And so instead, that person, let's say if they have a need for reassurance, that person can be like, hey, I really feel upset right now because I feel like I need reassurance, but I feel like I want you to intuit the fact that I need reassurance because somehow that's going to be even more reassuring. And so that person can get very, very into the depths of what it is they're feeling and why it is they're acting the way that they're acting, and trying to get as comfortable as possible, really laying out the full honest truth on the table and say, this is how I'm feeling, this is what I'm trying to get from you, are you willing to give that thing to me? And basically asking more directly. Now, to get practice with this, what I would recommend doing is you can either do journaling or you can do what I do and like kind of talk to yourself in the mirror. So when it comes to getting used to crystallizing your feelings, your intuitions, your urges, what you want to have is you want to have a pretty smooth flow to where it's like the moment you get those intuitions that your mind automatically converts them into words so that you can express them effortlessly. And there's a bit of a learning curve when it comes to this, because the way I would describe it is that when intuitions flow in, or big emotions flow in, it's almost like water crashing onto the shores of an island and leaving lots of debris behind. And then you actually have to go back, into that debris, and you have to go in and organize it in some kind of structure of some kind. And so it's sort of like there can be a bit of a lag. So what I experienced before I really learned how to crystallize things quickly and easily, and it's like what I do for my work, as a coach, I really have to think on my feet like that. So I get a lot of practice. So at first, what you might find is that there's a big lag and that you're going to need some time to really figure out what's going on with your intuition and figure out how your emotions are coming through and what they mean and what they indicate that you want or what you don't want or what you need to communicate. And so at first, it's probably going to be a very nebulous process. And you're probably going to have like these kind of shutdown moments where you just get too much intuitive information at once and you can't quite organize it in time. But the more you practice with journaling or with talking to yourself in the mirror or with talking to other people and practicing sharing from your perspective and how you feel and what you need, the more easy and smooth it'll become. It's a little bit like starting to play an instrument. So it's like at first it's a really, really awkward thing, and then it becomes automatic. And so when it comes to talking about these kind of like wordless intuitions and emotions that come up that you want to crystallize, what you want to first do is you want to start notice what are the feelings that I'm feeling, like what emotions are coming up. And you can put emotional words to them like, oh, I feel anger right now, or I feel anticipation, or I feel excitement. So that's one way to crystallize things. Then you can also talk about how those feelings are coming up as sensations in the body. It's like, okay, I feel a heaviness in my chest, or I feel like this weird feeling in my stomach that, has like a kind of tingly sort of vibe to it. Or, oh, I feel a lot of tension in my shoulders. Then you want to describe what's going on in your mind in terms of thoughts and different patterns. And, how fast are those thoughts going, and what are you thinking, and what meanings are you making of certain situations? Then if you catch yourself wanting to manipulate or manipulating, it's asking yourself, what is the reaction that I want this other person to have? Why do I want that reaction from them? Is it that, how am I going to feel different, or how are things going to be different if they react that way? For example, one time I was having this situation where I was talking to somebody and I had a certain sense that I wanted to communicate something, but I didn't know what that thing was that I wanted to communicate. So I assumed that there was something there to be communicated. But it was less about wanting to communicate something, but more so trying to think of a strategy to get them to react a particular way. And I just didn't have a strategy for doing that. And so it was noticing that, oh, I actually don't want to say anything to this person. I don't have anything to say, but I want them to react a certain way. And I don't have any tools in my toolbox for getting them to do that. And so sometimes when we run into blanks in terms of what it is that we want to communicate, or what it is that we want to say, it's oftentimes looking to what's the response we're hoping to get from the other person. And how is that response going to resolve some uncomfortable feeling in ourselves, or give us some kind of need, or, something of that nature. But overall, one of the things that I want to most drive across here in this episode is just how sneaky the manipulation tactics can be. Sometimes, like I said, we can be manipulating and not even realizing it. And so we want to almost be on the lookout for these different things. And when it comes to, let's say, if you have a shadow work practice, noticing the ways that you're trying to manipulate can give you a lot of clarity about what's going on in the unconscious. So if you would like to learn more about shadow work and the different unconscious drivers that drive your behavior, I highly recommend checking out my shadow work playlist. It's got, I think, about 25 different videos. They're all on the topic of shadow work, and it explores that topic from a lot of different angles. So I highly recommend checking that out. Also, you can check out, if you would like to, my free shadow integration masterclass, the 6 simple steps to shadow integration, by going to shadowintegration.org/masterclass. And that's all I have for you for now. And until next time, keep becoming more you.